After spending nearly 3 decades on death row, Darlie Routier remains under a sentence of death in the state of Texas. She is 55 years old, convicted of capital murder for the killing of her 2 sons, Damon Routier and Devon Routier. She has lived for almost 28 years knowing that the state intends to execute her by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit if her remaining legal efforts fail. In this video, we will examine what happened, the evidence that caused investigators to turn on a surviving mother, the cemetery footage that shaped a national narrative, and the forensic questions that continue to divide experts decades later. But to understand how Darlie Routier went from a suburban mother to one of the most controversial women on death row in America, we have to go back to the early morning hours of June 6, 1996, to a quiet home in Rowlett, Texas, and a 911 call that marked the beginning of everything. June 6, 1996. 2:31 in the morning. Rowlett, Texas. A 911 dispatcher received a call that would become one of the most closely examined recordings in American criminal history. On the other end of the line was a woman in clear distress. Her name was Darlie Routier. She was 26 years old. "My babies are dying," she cried. She told the dispatcher that someone had entered the home while they were sleeping downstairs, that her young boys had been attacked, and that she had just woken up to find them gravely injured. The call lasted 5 minutes and 44 seconds. Police arrived within minutes. Inside the home at 5801 Eagle Drive, officers found a scene that immediately raised alarms. 2 young boys were lying on the floor of the family room, both suffering from severe injuries. One had already died. They had been stabbed repeatedly. One had died on the spot, while the other was still alive when help arrived, but would not survive. Nearby stood their mother. She was injured, bleeding, and conscious. Her throat was slashed. Her arms were cut. Blood was everywhere. But she was alive. And she was talking. The house showed signs of violence, confusion, and panic. From that moment forward, the question facing investigators was no longer just what happened inside that home, but who was responsible. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. When she was 15 years old, she moved to Lubbock, Texas, with her mother and stepfather. Her mother, Darlie Key, got a job at a Western Sizzlin' restaurant. Working there as a cook was a 17-year-old boy named Darren Routier. He was the assistant regional manager, voted most likely to succeed in high school, described as quiet, hard-working, and mature for his age. When young Darlie walked into that restaurant, it was love at first sight. She was well developed for her age, with blonde hair, curves, and charm. The complete package. Darren and Darlie had their first date that same night. They became inseparable. In August 1988, a little more than 3 years after they met, they got married. Darlie was 18. Darren was 20. They had their whole lives ahead of them. And for a while, everything they touched turned to gold. Darren started a business called TestNeck that tested electronic components. The company became very successful. In 1995, TestNeck brought in approximately $500,000 in gross revenues, and Darren paid himself an annual salary of $125,000. The Routiers moved to Rowlett, Texas, an affluent suburb east of Dallas. They purchased a beautiful 2-story brick home on Eagle Drive and spent thousands of dollars renovating it. Darren bought a 1982 Jaguar and a 30-foot cabin cruiser to use on nearby Lake Ray Hubbard. Darlie got size 36 DDD breast implants in 1992 and wore diamond rings on every finger. She had long, bleached blonde hair, fake nails, and a closet full of designer clothes. To their neighbors, the Routiers were living the American dream. But the Routiers were more than just their flashy lifestyle. Despite their appearances, they were well liked by everyone in the neighborhood. Darlie was known as a cookie-baking housewife who made meals for neighbors going through hard times. She once made a mortgage payment for a friend who had cancer. For the neighborhood kids who would eventually testify in her favor at trial, Darlie baked cookies and hosted parties. Devon Rush Routier was born on June 14, 1989, less than a year after his parents married. Damon Christian Routier came along on February 19, 1991, and on October 18, 1995, the Routiers welcomed their third son, Drake. 3 beautiful boys, a successful business, a gorgeous home. From the outside, it looked like the Routier had everything, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. In early 1996, Darren's business started to suffer. Orders slowed down, revenue dropped, the bills started piling up. The Routiers were at least a month behind on their mortgage. They owed $10,000 in back taxes to the IRS and $12,000 on credit cards. The day before the murders, Darren applied for a $5,000 vacation loan and was turned down due to their precarious financial situation. But if the money problems were causing stress in their marriage, the neighbors never saw it. Darren and Darlie never argued in public. Darlie's shopping never slowed. She was even planning a trip to Cancun with some girlfriends that summer. The Routiers seemed determined to maintain their image of the perfect family, no matter what was happening behind closed doors. Then came the diary entry that would haunt Darlie at trial. On May 3, 1996, just 1 month before the murders, Darlie made an unusual entry in her otherwise upbeat diary. She was suffering from postpartum depression after the birth of Drake. In the entry, she talked about suicide. She addressed her 3 sons and begged them to forget her and stop taking ownership of her passing. Prosecutors would later seize on this entry as evidence of her mental state. But Darlie's family would argue it was simply the ramblings of a woman struggling with a condition that affects millions of new mothers. Whatever the truth, that diary entry would come back to haunt her. The night of June 5, 1996, seemed like any other night in the Routier household. Darren and Darlie stayed up late talking, past midnight. They kissed each other goodnight. Darren went upstairs to the master bedroom, where 7-month-old Drake was asleep in his crib. Darlie stayed downstairs. She had been sleeping on the couch that week. She later explained, because Devon and Damon had been sleeping in the family room since school let out. They liked it down there. And Darlie was a light sleeper who would sometimes be awakened by Drake turning over in his crib. So she curled up on the couch next to her 2 older boys, who were sleeping on the floor. The television was on. The house was quiet. And somewhere around 2:30 in the morning, everything changed. In her statement to police, Darlie said she was awakened by Damon touching her shoulder and crying out, "Mommy, Mommy." In the darkness, she did not even realize she had been hurt. She saw a man moving through the kitchen toward the garage. She followed him. She saw a knife on the floor of the utility room. The man had apparently dropped it during his escape. She picked it up. She later told the 911 dispatcher that she had touched the knife, that her fingerprints were on it, and she hoped they would still be able to get the prints of the attacker. She placed the knife on the kitchen counter. She looked down and realized she was covered in blood. Her throat had been slashed. Her arms were cut. She screamed for Darren. She saw Devon and Damon lying on the floor in pools of blood. And then she called 911. When police arrived, they found a scene of unspeakable violence. Devon was already dead. Damon was gasping for breath. He would die shortly after. Darlie was bleeding heavily from her throat and arms, but she was alert and talking. She told officers that a white male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a black shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap, had attacked her and her children. She said he had escaped through the garage. Investigators searched the house and the surrounding area. They found that a window screen in the garage had been cut, which appeared to support Darlie's story of an intruder. They found a large kitchen knife on the counter, covered in blood. It had come from a knife block in the Routier kitchen, one of the biggest knives in the set, the murder weapon. But almost immediately, investigators began to notice things that did not add up. Things that made them question whether Darlie Routier was telling the truth. The garage where the intruder had allegedly escaped showed no signs that anyone had run through it. There were no blood drops on the floor. The windowsills had untouched layers of dust, including the window that had been cut. If someone had climbed through that window, they would have disturbed the dust. They did not. The mulch in the flower beds between the garage and the backyard gate was undisturbed. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had fled that way. Inside the house, investigators found circular blood drops on the kitchen floor. Circular drops indicate that the blood was deposited by someone standing still or walking very slowly, not running, not chasing an intruder. Luminol testing revealed Darlie's bloody footprints in front of the kitchen sink. The blood patterns suggested she had been standing there for a significant amount of time, bleeding. There was evidence that blood had been cleaned up around the sink area. And then there was the vacuum cleaner. A vacuum had been found knocked over on top of Darlie's bloody footprints. Broken glass lay on top of the blood drops on the floor. This suggested the glass had been broken after the blood was deposited. Someone had staged this crime scene. Then there was the matter of Darlie's behavior during and after the 911 call. Officers testified that she seemed eerily calm and alert at times during the call. She failed to follow the dispatcher's instructions to apply pressure to Damon's wounds. When paramedics arrived to take Damon away, she did not follow them. She did not ask where they were taking him. She was more concerned with asking officers whether her jewelry had been stolen. Hospital nurses who treated Darlie said her behavior was unusual for a mother who had just lost 2 children. She did not cry very often. She seemed withdrawn. She was more emotional about her hair not being done properly than about the death of her sons. Prosecutors would later argue that this was the behavior of a guilty woman, not a grieving mother. But perhaps the most damning evidence against Darlie Routier was not found at the crime scene or in her hospital room. It was found at a cemetery. 8 days after Devon and Damon were brutally stabbed to death, the Routier family held a birthday party at the boys' graves. It would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Local news station KSAS Channel 5 was invited to record the event. What their cameras captured would shock the nation. The video shows Darlie Routier standing at her son's graves, smiling, laughing, chewing gum. She is singing Happy Birthday and spraying silly string all over the graves. There are balloons, there are gifts, there is even an airplane overhead towing a Happy Birthday banner. Darlie appears almost giddy. Her husband Darren stands behind her, his hands in his pockets, his head down. He takes a step backward, as if embarrassed, when Darlie begins spraying the silly string. The contrast between their demeanors is striking. When prosecutor Greg Davis saw that video, he knew he had found the key to his case. Because it had only been a week since these boys' deaths, and yet we have got a full-blown birthday party out there at the gravesite, Davis would later say. And it really struck me as more than curious. 4 days after the silly string video aired on local television, Darlie Routier was arrested and charged with capital murder. The video would become the most powerful weapon in the prosecution's arsenal. They would play it for the jury over and over again. Some jurors would later admit they watched it 7 or 8 times during deliberations. Darlie's supporters have always argued that the video was taken out of context. They claim that before the cameras started rolling, the Routiers held a solemn memorial service for the boys. They prayed, they cried. The silly string celebration was supposed to be a tribute to Devon, a way to honor his memory with joy rather than tears. But the jury never saw that part. And the image of a mother laughing and spraying silly string on her murdered children's graves became seared into the public consciousness. The trial of Darlie Routier began on January 6, 1997, in Kerrville, Texas. The venue had been changed from Dallas County due to the intense media coverage of the case. Kerrville was located in one of the most conservative counties in Texas, a place with a high rate of conviction in death penalty cases. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Greg Davis, with Toby Shook and Sherry Wallace assisting. The defense was led by Doug Mulder, a prominent local defense attorney who had been hired by the Routier family after they mortgaged their homes to pay his fees. The prosecution's strategy was clear from the start. They would paint Darlie Routier as a self-centered, materialistic, vain woman whose lavish lifestyle was threatened by financial problems and the responsibilities of motherhood. She was no longer the glamorous blonde center of attention, prosecutors argued. Her children had stolen the spotlight, and she wanted it back. The prosecution called 38 witnesses to build their circumstantial case. Crime scene consultant James Cron testified that evidence suggested the scene inside the Routier home had been staged. He had arrived at the scene at 5:30 in the morning and within 20 minutes had concluded that Darlie was the killer. Blood spatter expert Tom Bevel testified about the blood patterns found on Darlie's nightshirt. He told the jury that cast-off blood on the back of her shirt indicated she had raised the knife over her head as she withdrew it from each boy to stab again. This was damning testimony. It suggested that Darlie had been standing behind her sons, stabbing them repeatedly, the blood flying off the knife blade and onto her back with each vicious swing. Prosecutors also presented evidence that screen fibers from the cut garage window had been found on a bread knife in the Routier kitchen. This suggested that Darlie had cut the screen herself to stage the break-in. She had used a bread knife to cut the screen, then used a larger butcher knife to murder her children. The prosecution suggested a financial motive for the murders. Both boys had life insurance policies on them. But the defense quickly countered that the policies totaled only $10,000, not even enough to cover the funeral expenses, which exceeded $14,000. Furthermore, they asked, if Darlie was willing to murder for money, why did she not kill her husband instead? Darren had an $800,000 life insurance policy. And why, if she killed her sons to preserve her lavish lifestyle, did she leave her youngest son, 7-month-old Drake, alive upstairs? The prosecution had no good answers to these questions, but they did not need them. They had the silly string video, and they played it over and over again. The defense strategy focused on the lack of evidence against Darlie. There was no motive, no confession, and no witnesses. Defense attorney Richard Mosty told the jury, there is absolutely no reason for her to kill those children. They brought in medical and psychiatric experts who said they believed Darlie was telling the truth about the intruder. San Antonio Chief Medical Examiner Vincent DeMaio testified that the wound to Darlie's neck came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. 2 millimeters. The width of a pencil lead. If the knife had gone just slightly deeper, Darlie would have bled to death within minutes. DeMaio said this wound was not consistent with the self-inflicted wounds he had seen in his career. It was too deep, too dangerous. No one trying to fake an injury would cut that close to their own carotid artery. But then Darlie Routier made a decision that would destroy her case. Against the advice of her attorneys, she took the witness stand. It was a disaster. Under cross-examination by prosecutor Toby Shook, Darlie crumbled. She cried at odd times. She became defensive. She claimed to have amnesia about key events, but Shook hammered her for what he called her selective amnesia. Every time the prosecution presented a piece of damning evidence, Darlie would suddenly remember something new to explain it away. The jury did not believe her. She claims to have amnesia, yet the amnesia was very convenient, Shook would later say. If she needed to explain a piece of damaging circumstantial evidence, she would come up with a new story. She would have a memory of it. The trial lasted nearly 5 weeks. On January 31, 1997, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for about 8 hours over 2 days. During those deliberations, they watched the silly string video 7 or 8 times. On February 1, 1997, they returned with a verdict: guilty of capital murder. 3 days later, on February 4th, the jury sentenced Darlie Routier to death by lethal injection. She became one of only a handful of women on death row in America. Darlie's mother, Darlie Key, was devastated. They ended up deliberating on the silly string, she would later say. Silly string is not a lethal weapon. But the silly string video was not the only controversy surrounding Darlie's trial. There was a piece of evidence that the jury never saw, one that might have changed everything. Police had secretly placed recording devices at the boys' gravesite. They were conducting surveillance on the Routier family. That surveillance captured something that was never shown to the jury. It showed that on the day of the infamous silly string celebration, the Routier first held a solemn memorial service for their boys. They prayed. They cried. They grieved. The silly string party came afterward, after the cameras had stopped rolling during the solemn part. But because of legal concerns about the hidden surveillance, that tape was never shown to the jury. They only saw the silly string. They never saw the tears. There is another piece of evidence that has haunted investigators for nearly 3 decades. A bloody sock. One of Darren Routier's socks was found in an alley 75 yards from the house. It contained blood from both Devon and Damon, but none of Darlie's blood. The prosecution argued that Darlie had planted the sock to make it look like an intruder had fled the scene. But there was a problem. If Darlie had planted that sock, how did she avoid leaving a trail of her own blood? Once her throat was cut, she lost significant amounts of blood. There should have been blood on the back patio, on the back fence, in the alley. There was none. No blood anywhere outside the house except on that sock. And then there is the timeline. According to the medical examiner, Damon could not have survived longer than 9 minutes after being stabbed, probably no more than 6 minutes. Darlie was on the phone with 911 for 5 minutes and 44 seconds. A police officer arrived just as the call was ending and was with Darlie for at least another minute before paramedics arrived. Damon was still alive when they got there. If you do the math, Darlie had only about 2 minutes to stab her sons, head to the garage, cut the screen, climb through the window, jump the back fence, or go through the gate, run barefoot for 75 yards down a dark alley, drop the bloody sock, run 75 yards back, climb back into the house, stab herself, clean up the blood around the sink, stage the crime scene, and then call 911. 2 minutes. Is that even possible? The appeals began almost immediately after the conviction. Darlie's appellate attorneys discovered that court reporter Sandra Halsey had made more than 30,000 errors in the trial transcript. 30,000. Words were missing. Testimony was garbled. Entire exchanges were incorrectly recorded. But the appeals courts ruled that the errors were not significant enough to warrant a new trial. The defense also argued that Darlie's trial attorney, Doug Mulder, had a conflict of interest because he had previously represented her husband Darren in an unrelated gag order hearing. This too was denied. In 2008, a court ordered DNA testing on key pieces of evidence: the bloody sock, the nightshirt, fingerprints found at the scene. But the testing has been plagued by bureaucratic delays. In 2017, prosecutors discovered that materials that were supposed to have been transported to the Department of Public Safety for testing had never been transported. They had sat in storage for years. In 2018, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals sent the case back to the trial court for review of DNA evidence and other claims. In 2021, a judge ordered additional DNA testing on the sock and other items. In February 2024, a judge signed off on testing of the sock, ordering that samples be sent to the UNT Center for Human Identification within 30 days. As of today, the results are still pending. Darlie Routier has been waiting for DNA results for 16 years. The testing that could prove her innocence or confirm her guilt remains incomplete. There are other pieces of evidence that continue to trouble investigators. A bloody fingerprint was found on a coffee table at the crime scene. In 2002, testing determined it did not belong to anyone in the Routier family. Who left that print? A fingerprint was also found on the garage windowsill where the intruder allegedly entered. It, too, did not match anyone in the family. Fingerprint expert Pat Wertheim would later testify that he could not rule out Darlie Routier's right ring finger as the source of the print. But he also could not confirm it was hers. These unidentified prints remain unexplained. And there is one more piece of evidence that has never been fully explored. In the spring of 1996, just months before the murders, Devon Routier approached his father-in-law about an insurance scam. He wanted to find someone to break into his home and fake a burglary so he could collect insurance money. He later admitted to investigators that it was possible he had discussed this plan with others as well, including people connected to car theft rings in the area. Did someone take that plan too far? Did Darren's insurance scam lead to a real break-in that went horribly wrong? Darlie Routier has maintained her innocence for nearly 28 years. In 2018, ABC aired a documentary series called The Last Defense that examined her case in detail. In it, Darlie spoke about the silly string video that had done so much damage at trial. Devon wanted to be 7, she said. I did the only thing I knew to do to honor him and give him all his wishes because he was not here anymore. But how do you know what you're going to do when you lose 2 children? How do you know how you are going to act? Her ex-husband Darren, who divorced Darlie in 2011 but continues to believe in her innocence, also appeared in the documentary. It is not too late, he said, because Darlie is not dead. The case of Darlie Routier raises difficult questions that have no easy answers. Did a suburban mother stab her 2 young sons to death while they slept, then slash her own throat to cover up the crime? Or was she the victim of a botched home invasion, a rush to judgment by police, and a trial infected by media sensationalism? The silly string video showed a woman laughing at her children's graves. But it did not show the tears that came before. The blood evidence suggested she staged the crime scene, but it could not explain how she planted a sock 75 yards away without leaving a trail of her own blood. The prosecution said she murdered her sons for insurance money. But the policies would not have covered the funeral costs. And the DNA evidence that could answer these questions once and for all remains untested, sitting in a laboratory somewhere in Texas, waiting. As of today, Darlie Routier remains on death row at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas. She is 55 years old. She has not touched or hugged her surviving son Drake since her conviction in 1997. He was 7 months old when his brothers were murdered. He is now 30 years old. He grew up visiting his mother through bulletproof glass. Drake lives in Texas with his father. Darren has remarried, but continues to advocate for Darlie's release. He has her image and the images of their 3 sons tattooed on his arm. No execution date has been set. The DNA testing continues. And Darlie Routier waits. She has been waiting for nearly 3 decades. Her mother, Darlie Key, visits her regularly. She has never once doubted her daughter's innocence. I want my daughter home, Key has said. And then we will grieve together for Devon and Damon. Devon Rush Routier would be 36 years old today. He wanted to be 7. He never got to celebrate that birthday except at a gravesite with silly string and balloons while his mother was filmed by news cameras. Damon Christian Routier would be 34 years old. He was stabbed multiple times in the back as he slept on the floor of his family room. His bloody handprint was found on the couch, revealed by luminol. In his final moments, little Damon had tried to pull himself up, tried to escape, tried to survive. He made it to his mother's side. "Mommy, Mommy," he cried. Those were the last words he ever spoke. Whether his mother saved his life or took it is a question that has haunted America for nearly 28 years. The case of Darlie Routier is far from over. DNA testing continues. January, motions are being filed. Legal battles rage on. A 16-year-old true crime blogger from Rockwall recently took the Dallas District Attorney's Office to court, demanding access to evidence from the original trial. He wants to see what the jury saw. He wants to understand how they convicted her. There are still questions to be answered, still evidence to be tested, still a woman on death row maintaining her innocence. Did Darlie Routier murder her 2 sons in cold blood, then stage an elaborate crime scene to cover her tracks? Or did an unknown intruder enter her home that night, slaughter 2 innocent children, and leave a mother to take the blame for nearly 3 decades? The truth, whatever it may be, lies somewhere in the evidence. In a bloody sock found 75 yards from a house. In a silly string video that shocked a nation. In unidentified fingerprints that have never been matched. In DNA samples that have sat untested for 16 years. And in a mother's unwavering claim of innocence, repeated from behind prison walls, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Justice, such as it is, remains uncertain. The families continue to wait. The debate continues to rage. And Darlie Routier, the woman they called the silly string killer, continues to sit on death row, waiting for answers that may never come.